Did we really need another romanticised adaptation of Wuthering Heights? When Hollywood thinks of Wuthering Heights, they think of tragic romance, windy moors, star-crossed lovers, and emotional longing. But Bronte's Wuthering Heights is a story about ghosts, obsession, and cruelty. It is about a man who begs a dead woman to haunt him, who digs up her grave and calls a decayed body beautiful, and about a woman who returns from the dead, bleeding and scratching at a window, refusing to be forgotten. It is about grief that turns into cruelty. In other words, it's a horror story. Yet, for almost a century, filmmakers have tried to pretend that it isn't, flattening the story of emotional haunting into safe, sentimental romance. Its ugliness is softened, its darkness is reframed as passion, and the latest attempt comes from Emerald Fennell. So this video isn't just about whether her adaptation works or fails, but about why Wuthering Heights keeps getting domesticated, and what we lose every time that this happens, because this novel was meant to disturb. Wuthering Heights is one of my favourite books of all time, but this doesn't mean that I'm coming at this from an overprotective, anti-change perspective. In fact, I actually think that some of the best adaptations ever brought to screen radically transform their source material. It's long been agreed amongst adaptation scholars that fidelity does not equate to quality. An adaptation, be that into a new medium for a new generation, or like with Wuthering Heights, both, is inherently a mode of translation. Simply put, a book cannot be a movie and a movie cannot be a book. Therefore, many agree that the best way to approach adaptation is to accept that replication is impossible, and that trying to achieve it often results in lifeless cinema. With this in mind, I was genuinely intrigued by Fennell's version. I say intrigued rather than excited, as my feelings about her previous work, particularly Saltburn, and the odd casting choices kept my expectations in check. But still, when she described her adaptation as a misremembered version of the novel, and put quotation marks around the title to show distance, I was curious, especially because this false view of Wuthering Heights is quite a culturally persistent one.
Look, there's a version that I remembered reading that isn't quite real. And there's a version that I there's a version where I wanted stuff to happen that never happened. And so it is Wuthering Heights and it isn't.
The novel has long been divisive, largely because many readers approach it expecting a sweeping romance, and are unsettled when they instead encounter cruelty, obsession, and generational trauma. But this expectation hasn't come from nowhere. The book's reputation as a romance owes far more to adaptation and cultural myth than to the text itself. It was exactly this dichotomy that I hoped Fennell's film might engage with. I dreamt of a Nosferatu-like approach to adaptation, an adaptation of an adaptation. A version of Wuthering Heights which would retain this narrative romanticization, but would utilize grotesque visuals to call out the irony of this approach to the story. My best hope was that Fennell was going to engage with the novel's Hollywood history and bring something new to the conversation. Written by Emily Brontë and published in 1847, Wuthering Heights has long been in the public domain, meaning it has been freely available for adaptation for over a century. As a result, the novel has inspired countless screen versions, including interpretations set in the Mexican countryside and in Japan's Muromachi period. The story is no stranger to reinvention, and given this history, it might seem surprising that many readers reacted so protectively to news of Emerald Fennell's adaptation. Despite this not being exactly how I felt, there is a key reason that many did respond like this. There has never been a truly great or faithful film version of Wuthering Heights. And while I don't feel that fidelity should always be the goal, I do admit that it is painful to see that time and time again, adaptations have flattened the novel's complexity and reframed it primarily as a tragic romance. This tendency can be traced back to the first major sound film adaptation of Wuthering Heights, released in 1939. An earlier silent version was released in 1920, but it's now considered lost. Surviving posters advertised it with the tagline Emily Bronte's tremendous story of hate, emphasizing the novel's brutality and moral darkness. By contrast, the 1939 film was promoted as the strangest love story ever told, signaling a dramatic shift in emphasis. This shift reflects the influence of the Hays Code, which governed Hollywood from 1934 until 1968. The code discouraged moral ambiguity, forbade sympathetic portrayals of criminals, restricted representations of interracial relationships, insisted on clear moral resolution, and more. Within this framework, Wuthering Heights had to be sanitized. Its cruelty, social critique, and psychological darkness was softened into respectable passion. Heathcliff was played by a white actor, erasing much of the racial and social ambiguity that remains persistently referenced in the novel, wherein he is repeatedly marked as dark, foreign and socially other. Yet traces of this ambiguity linger in the film through subtle forms of cosmetic darkening and through dialogue that continues to describe Heathcliff as dark, revealing an uneasy attempt to preserve racial difference without openly representing it. This erasure is made all the more ironic by the casting of Mel Oberon as Kathy, whose own mixed heritage was concealed by Hollywood's racial conventions, exposing the tragic irony of how racism functioned in Hollywood very similarly to how it does in the novel. The entire second half of the novel was removed in its adaptation, and the result was a template that would dominate adaptations for decades. With the intense cruelty of the second half removed, the generational cycle gone, and the romance upped, a new version of Wuthering Heights was created. As Truman Capote famously observed in Breakfast at Tiffany's, audiences often confuse this Hollywood fantasy with the novel's literary reality, and to this day, many viewers mistake this romanticised version for Bronte's novel itself. Therefore, when Fennell's adaptation kept both of these things intact, I found myself less angry and more bored. Even my worst predictions for her adaptation had assumed something more than this. I wasn't expecting to definitely like it, but I was expecting at the very least to be surprised by some of her choices. Yet there I was, rolling my eyes and stifling a yawn. With all the marketing and Fennell's past work, I thought I knew what to expect. Some kind of grotesque eroticism. Wuthering Heights might not be an erotic novel, but I was genuinely intrigued to see the story adapted via this framework. Bronte's novel was scandalous upon publication, and it remains pretty shocking even today. She was viewed as strange, even witch-like, and rumours circulated that her brother must have written such a violent text. Its cruelty and emotional intensity were transgressive, and in theory, increasing eroticism in an adaptation could communicate this transgression to modern audiences. Prior to the release of the film, Fennell claimed a lot of things. She claimed the book as a favourite and declared that her adaptation was one that would push things until they're almost ugly.
There's always a moment where you're like, no, that is too much. But, I like to push things till they're almost ugly.
But unfortunately for me, Emerald Fennell appears completely incapable of more than a little shock humour. Her adaptation is glossy and consumable, with all the ugliness of the novel wiped away, to a degree that actually kinda surprised me. Her version of Wuthering Heights is surprisingly safe and closely aligned with Hollywood tradition. I found myself wishing that it was more reckless, more willing to embrace excess, discomfort, and moral darkness, more willing to go against expectations. I was okay with any changes to the novel, so long as the novel's essence was captured, but Fennell fails on all accounts. Now, in all fairness, this is a tricky task to achieve. Part of what makes Wuthering Heights so difficult to adapt is its ambiguity and complexity. Its complexity is an easy obstacle to understand. Like with so many novels, there is simply too much to fit within a film's runtime. This means that things have to be excluded, but after decades of films focusing on the same part of the story as Fennell chose to, her choice of how to synthesize the novel is hard to excuse as anything but safe. The best attempts I've read to excuse this choice is a theory that Fennell was less bothered about adapting Emily Bronte's novel and more interested in revitalizing the Hollywood romance film, a genre largely absent over the past few years. Now, this could be an admirable task, and could be achieving exactly what I previously referenced. An adaptation not of the book, but instead of the 1939 film. An adaptation of 1939 with the addition of explicit sex, of course. Again, something that could be seen as an admirable undertaking. There have been numerous think pieces recently that claim Gen Z to be averse to sex scenes within films. Despite so-called spicy books booming in popularity amongst young women on Book Talk, similar content on screen is suggested as a big no-no. With the Me Too movement and the rise of intimacy coordinators, Hollywood's past of exploitation has been at the forefront of many people's minds. And thanks to this, nudity and intimacy on screen has been seen by some as a product of off-screen abuse, and thus something to be avoided. But the reality is not so simple. Abuse can occur no matter the content of a film, and sex on screen can be an important part of art and representation. But sadly for us, Fennell's Wuthering Heights achieves neither romance, an interesting engagement with sex politics, or, as some have more bluntly put it, mere sexiness. Eroticism in the film is repeatedly undercut by humour or awkwardness. Even potentially challenging material is neutralised through a fade to black evasion. Notably, the film seems to have some very odd sex politics at play. Any transgressive moments of sexuality are placed on the outskirts. They can never be performed within the confines of the real romance Fennell wants us to believe in. Kathy and Heathcliff are almost always clothed, their physical intimacy reduced to make-out scenes and the occasional finger in each other's mouth. The opening public hanging scene briefly briefly links arousal and danger, gesturing towards a more complex emotional landscape, but this promise is never sustained. Their affair carries no real risk. Conducted openly under Linton's roof, it is stripped of secrecy, consequence, or emotional volatility, and as a result, their relationship never feels dangerous, obsessive, or destabilizing. And this sanitization is directly contrasted by the film's treatment of Isabella. In the book, Isabella is subjected to extreme cruelty. She is raped by Heathcliff, her dog is hanged, and she is psychologically terrorized, yet she ultimately escapes with her dignity intact. In Fennell's version, Heathcliff's violence is removed and substituted with consensual sexual submission, reducing Isabella to a submissive joke. What was once tragic becomes playful, and what was once disturbing becomes performative. Heathcliff's darkness is redirected into sexual sadism, which he never exerts within his relationship with Cathy. Their love is presented as pure, protected from the brutality that defines his interactions elsewhere. In effect, the film separates acceptable romance from grotesque sexuality. Yet a more complex engagement with sexuality could precisely mirror the moral complexity of Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship that gives the novel its unsettling power. In the book, Cathy and Heathcliff's bond is not merely romantic. It's obsessive, possessive, and psychologically corrosive. It blurs the boundaries between familial, romantic, and self-annihilating attachment. Some critics have even suggested that Heathcliff may be Cathy's half-brother, a possibility that intensifies the quasi-incestuous undertones already present in their relationship. The novel's most intimate moments are also its most disturbing. Cathy's death in Heathcliff's arms, and Heathcliff's later exhumation of her corpse. These moments achieve a level of emotional and moral extremity that far exceeds anything in Fennell's film. Despite its lack of explicit sexual content, the book generates a far deeper sense of physical and psychological intimacy, and sadly, this is precisely what Fennell's adaptation neutralizes, despite all her bold claims. And by contrast, Fennell's attempts at kink feel superficial and emotionally hollow. It's hard to understand why the woman who filmed the Saltburn bathtub scene would want to remove such things, but I think it's clear. There's a clear divide between the sex we are supposed to see as romantic and that we are supposed to see as scandalous and even grotesque. I'd always read some complexity into Oliver's feelings in Saltburn. Sure, it was an obsession which resulted in violence, but I assumed there was also real love there. Seeing her attempt to display romance in Wuthering Heights has made me rethink this. In Fennell's Wuthering Heights, love is sanitized, and any subversion is saved for non-romantic relations, be that Joseph and Zilla's fling or Isabella and Heathcliff's power play. Cathy and Heathcliff, who we are supposed to root for in her version, are never unsettling in their sexuality. Their relationship in Bronte's novel, despite never being explicitly physical, is far more striking than anything Fennell shows. It is not safely packaged in romantic tropes. It's violent, complex, and at one point, borderline necrophilic. But there is also another reason Fennell's film can never reach the complexity of Bronte's book. In the novel, passion is powerful precisely because it is constrained by class, race, and emotional immaturity. Much of their desire emerges through negation, the lack of consummation. Fennell destroys this tension by making everything explicit. The film tries to borrow emotional weight directly from Brontë through scattered quotations, but these moments feel unearned because the surrounding narrative lacks equivalent intensity. Cathy and Heathcliff's relationship feels less like one where two people's souls are the same, and more like that of simple, fleshly desire, foregrounded by Cathy's sexual awakening, which feels odd given the aged-up nature of her within Fennell's film. The prolonged emotional stalemate between her and Heathcliff consequently appears irrational instead of tragic. The lack of believable romance is directly the result of how she has flattened the novel's themes, largely because she refuses to engage with the novel's ambiguity. The novel tells a story of two families across generations through a complex narrative framework. The story is filtered through two narrators, Nellie Dean and Mr. Lockwood. Lockwood recounts what Nellie tells him, and Nellie recounts her own memories. Neither is fully reliable. We never gain direct access to Heathcliff and Cathy's inner lives, and this distance is essential, and it's one of the novel's greatest strengths. But it's also another reason that it resists cinematic translation. Ambiguity cannot be presented on screen in the same way that it can within a novel. The visual has to clarify. Within Wuthering Heights, there is one very notable ambiguity that a film adaptation has to clarify, that being Heathcliff's race, the root of almost every event that occurs within the story. I'm going to begin this conversation by noting that the question of Heathcliff's race is not, despite popular debate, a settled matter among scholars. There is no clear consensus. In fact, sustained academic engagement with Heathcliff's racial identity identity did not meaningfully emerge until the late 20th century. Victorian readers were scandalised by the violence and the emotional brutality. Race, at least in recorded reception, was not really registered. And while this is all valuable to note, we must also note the bias of such institutions and decades. Just because literary scholars chose to ignore race doesn't mean that it wasn't there. In fact, the historical context of the novel suggests that race would very much have been at the forefront of Emily Bronte's mind. Wuthering Heights was published in 1847, just 14 years after Britain abolished slavery in 1833, and legal abolition did not mean racial equality. The British Empire was expanding aggressively, and racial hierarchies remained foundational to imperial capitalism. Conversations about race, colonial subjects, and national identity were therefore everywhere, and Liverpool, where Heathcliff is found, was one of the central port of the transatlantic slave trade, and remained a hub of imperial commerce. It was also a city populated by sailors, migrants, and displaced people from across the empire. Yorkshire, where the Brontes lived, was not far removed from this imperial economy. Newspapers frequently discussed colonial trade, race, and slavery, publications the Bronte siblings were known to read. Therefore, Heathcliff's origins are clearly not incidental. They are historically loaded. Yet it was not until the 2011 adaptation that a black actor was cast as Heathcliff for the very first time. Thanks to this, it's easy to question why on earth a director in 2026 would even consider casting a white man to play Heathcliff. The only potential risk of casting a non-white Heathcliff is the fear of racial caricature. Although not the popular view, some do interpret Bronte's novel as racist, seeing Heathcliff as a violent outsider whose cruelty confirms imperial prejudice rather than critiques it. But Fennell's Heathcliff isn't even a little bit cruel. He is more aligned with your average romantic hero than a gothic monster. So why not cast a non-white actor? Honestly, I struggle to think of an answer that isn't simply Fennell wanted to utilise Jacob Elordi's star power as the heartthrob du jour in promoting this film. With Elordi in the role of Heathcliff, Fennell completely obliterates all the racial undertones from the story. Now, this was the only acceptable route to take in casting a white actor as Heathcliff. This is certainly an area where I don't think an adaptation of the 1939 film approach, where a white Heathcliff is shown in subtle brownface and lines surrounding race from the novel are preserved, would be a good idea. The role of Heathcliff should be one of the greatest gifts an actor can be given, yet Fennell asks Elordi to do little more than smoulder around in a wet blouse. Not only is this a tragic waste of his potential, but it's also insulting, not just to Elordi, but to us, the audience. The film consistently prioritises likability over meaning, revealing Fennell's apparent reluctance to allow her protagonist to become genuinely repellent. What remains is not a figure shaped by deprivation and rage, but a softened romantic fantasy. With Heathcliff so changed, Fennell had to work overtime to get the rest of the story to fit. At its core, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights is about cycles of abuse. Heathcliff begins as a victim, humiliated, racialized, and excluded, and over time he learns to wield the tools of power that once oppressed him. His revenge is not merely personal, but structural. He manipulates inheritance, destroys families, and emotionally mutilates children to punish the dead. He becomes, in effect, a gothic monster, one who tries to make ghosts suffer by tormenting their descendants. All of this is neutered from the get-go. Its true motives can no longer apply. Hindley's role as Heathcliff's primary abuser and the entire second generation, essential to Bronte's commentary on inherited trauma, are completely erased. Instead, Mr. Earnshaw becomes Heathcliff's abuser, and instead of being class and racially motivated, it is merely the result of drunken violence, something that can be dished out to both Cathy and Heathcliff. Similarly, Cathy's marriage to Edgar loses its symbolic weight. In the novel, Edgar represents security, whiteness, and economic survival. Cathy's choice is shaped by financial precarity and social hierarchy. Fennell's adaptation reduces this to a more understandable escape from debt. Like Heathcliff, Fennell's Cathy is far less cruel than she is in the novel. In the novel, Cathy's capacity for emotional violence and self-deception is central to her complexity. Fennell weakens these traits, and as a result, Cathy becomes less contradictory, less troubling, and ultimately less compelling. She is transformed from a figure torn apart by incompatible desires into a comparatively straightforward romantic heroine who makes some bad choices. Worst of all is the effect that removing Heathcliff's racial ambiguity has on his return and the beginning nothing, indeed all the film ever grants us, of his revenge. His reappearance as a wealthy man resembles a makeover montage rather than the outcome of a decades-long campaign of bitterness and calculation. Hatred becomes hurt feelings. Entitlement to Kathy becomes wounded devotion. This shift is inseparable from the film's treatment of race and class. His outsider status becomes choice rather than politics. His rise becomes visual transformation instead of structural critique. In the novel, his entire arc, disappearing and returning rich, can be read as an attempt to reclaim power within a system that has denied him humanity. He masters the tools that once excluded him, but derives no pleasure. Crucially, no amount of wealth erases his difference. Money does not grant him acceptance, and racial and social prejudice persist. His transformation is not a glow-up, but a long, rage-fueled accumulation of capital deployed with spite. Within Fennell's film, it simply feels like all he couldn't give Kathy was money, so now he's returned able to please her, something he freely does. The only obstacle that ever really exists is emotional immaturity and a bit of debt, making for a far less compelling story than Bronte's. Rather than such complexity and commentary, the film's approach to race and diversity relies on tokenistic gestures rather than structural engagement. Supporting roles are assigned to actors of colour, functioning as a kind of insurance against criticism rather than any meaningful inclusion. A particularly bad look considering that the only diversity found is in the casting of Nellie and Linton. Linton's race is merely another nail in the coffin at the removal of Bronte's racial politics. But combined with Isabella and Nellie's race, a worse reading is opened up. Fennell's film is clearly one that is rooting for Kathy and Heathcliff's romance. Thus Linton here is an obstacle. Perhaps not quite a villain, but not someone she wants the audience to root for. Isabella is less of an obstacle as she happily complies with Heathcliff. But her whiteness is preserved. No longer Linton's sister, she is turned into his ward. Her whiteness preserved, seemingly so Fennell's scenes of sexual sadism never have to approach any kind of racial politics. Fennell's Nellie, however, aligns far more with villainy than even her Heathcliff. Despite Fennell's claims that she doesn't present Nellie as the villain, the film itself does very little to support this. Her complexity is replaced with simple acts of jealousy. In the book, she is kind to Heathcliff, helps raise the next generation, and while she does make mistakes, it's always understandable. Fennell's Nellie is purposefully malicious. She burns letters, doesn't believe Kathy when she says she's had a miscarriage, and purposefully coaxes Kathy into insulting Heathcliff, who she locks eyes with before he listens. I find it hard to see that she's not being presented as the villain, which I guess is needed when the repressive society can no longer work. When structural oppression disappears, villainy must be relocated into an individual body, and Nellie becomes the container for a moral clarity the novel refuses. The final baffling choice I want to draw attention to is Fennell's removal of the so-called supernatural ambiguity of the novel. Fennell's film is obsessed with visual symbolism. Like much of her filmmaking career, lots of the film's meaning is communicated through overly literal visual symbolism. Kathy's gift-wrapped dress reduces her to a decorative object. The dollhouse signals entrapment. Mr. Earnshaw's pile of bottles shows his alcoholism. The tight corset functions as an obvious metaphor for restriction. These motifs rarely invite interpretation. Instead, they bash the viewer over the head with how to feel. Worst of all, for over-explanation, is the skin room sequence. Its possible symbolic meanings, womb, shrine, fetish, bodily prison, are all rendered inert through excessive clarity. Symbolism like this can work well in the background, but when it's brought to the foreground through direct reference, it just feels lazy, unlike Fennell assumes stupidity from her audience. Sure, this kind of symbolism looks good in a still, but within the context of the film, it's almost distractingly pretty. Yet symbolism can be so much more than this. And, for risk of sounding repetitive, it's done so much better in Bronte's novel. Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights functions just as powerfully as a ghost story as it does a romance. In fact, a more explicitly supernatural adaptation of the story would retain more of its themes than the classic Hollywood romance reading. The novel begins and ends with an apparition. Kathy never truly disappears. Whether her presence is literal or psychological remains unresolved, but this uncertainty generates much of the book's emotional power. The characters are haunted not only by ghosts, but by memory, regret, and lost possibility. Symbolic ghosts. Love does not bring peace. It produces perpetual disturbance. Kathy and Heathcliff's passion is too intense to die peacefully. Their deaths offer no closure. The enduring power of this spectral dimension is evident in the opening, and stay with me for this, of the film Evil Dead Rise, which features a reading from Wuthering Heights before erupting into graphic violence and possession.
going to Daddy, friend. The intense horror of my nightmare came over me. I tried to draw back my arm, but the hand clung on. And a most melancholy voice sobbed. Let me in. Let me in. As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window.
Finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane.
Jess?
And rubbed it to
Please shut up.
and fro, till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Yet still it wailed, "Let me in!"
This reference is not incidental. It implicitly recognises the novel's affinity with horror. Kathy's first ghostly appearance at the window, pleading and begging to be let in, already contains the seeds of modern horror imagery. It's a moment of visceral terror as much as emotional tragedy. Bronte's novel is saturated with this atmosphere of menace, where love becomes a haunting force that refuses to remain safely in the past. Seen in this light, Wuthering Heights is far from a tragic romance. Instead, it's a sustained meditation on emotional possession and spiritual unrest. The lovers do not transcend the world, they linger within it, contaminating it with their unresolved desire. An adaptation that foregrounds these ghostly, bodily, and psychological elements would therefore come far closer to the novel's true spirit than one that prioritizes sentimental tragedy. And this is why, to this day, Kate Bush has still given us the best and most accurate adaptation of Wuthering Heights. It's no coincidence that her song chooses to focus on this moment. It is the core of Wuthering Heights.
Walking through the heights, it's me, I can't see, I come home back, so cold, let me in.
By neglecting this dimension, Fennell's film abandons one of the work's most radical qualities: its insistence that passion, once unleashed, becomes something monstrous. That when such passion is attempted to be constrained by social norms and moral boundaries, and even death itself, it becomes something incredibly volatile. Fennell's film avoids truly grotesque or excessive imagery, remaining trapped between restraint and stylization. It's not heightened enough to become camp, yet it's too stylized to feel raw. The visuals might flirt with extremity, but the narrative retreats from it. Seen in this light, Fennell's adaptation is disappointing not simply because it changes the novel, but because it changes it in the safest possible way. It inherits an almost century-old tradition of flattening Wuthering Heights into a love story, and it presents this tradition as innovation. There is no engagement with the historic weight of this change. There is just mere replication. The film offers passion without consequence, obsession without structural critique, and tragedy without true disturbance. When race, class, inheritance, generational trauma, narrative unreliability, and supernatural ambiguity are removed, something equally resonant must take their place. Here, nothing does. In trying to make the gothic monster palatable, the adaptation empties the story of what made it necessary. Wuthering Heights insists that love can become indistinguishable from cruelty, that wounds do not refine themselves into virtue, and that some passions rot rather than redeem. It is grotesque, exhausting, and unresolved, and to soften that into mere romance is to misunderstand it entirely. Although Fennell frequently argues that classics can be endlessly retold, such freedom is unevenly distributed. Only a small, highly privileged group possess the resources to reinterpret canonical texts on a global scale. In this context, interpretation becomes less an act of critical engagement and more a form of cultural repackaging. And personally, I'm sad that this is the version that we've been given. I still long for the true gothic monster to be brought to screen. I want Wuthering Heights the ghost story, not Wuthering Heights the rom-com. I also hate that this adaptation feels so representative of so many other issues at the moment. The media is constantly calling Gen Z stupid and suggesting that we don't have the attention span for classic literature. And just like I discussed in my last video all about Stranger Things, so many films and TV shows are being flattened for an audience that only half watches. Emerald Fennell's Wuthering Heights seamlessly fits into both of these categories. Yet when I look around at my generation, I just don't see this being true. Thank you so much for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the points I've raised, or anything that I've missed in this video, as this is kind of a discussion that can never end. Please like, subscribe, check out my links in the description and some of my other videos. And if you couldn't tell by my concluding point, this is a horror channel where I typically engage with horror films, and Fennell's film might be a far cry from that, but Bronte's gothic source material is exactly why I had to cover this, and Wuthering Heights should be perfectly at home here. In fact, I just want to quickly plug my Letterboxd account where I've made a list of films that would satiate the desire for a Wuthering Heights like the one I want, and I'll leave that list linked in the description.